Okay. All right. We're going to go ahead and start. I know we probably won't have very many people in here tonight because of Trump's speech, but I did want to go ahead and get it done for everybody. When they are done, they can come join us. I gotta take a deep breath, get a drink. And throw the water down my throat. I just signed in, got everything set up. And just as I went go live, my phone rang and my husband says, "Hey, I'm up on top of the shed. I need you to bring me the battery operated saw." Okay. We live on an acre and my shed is in the back on the back property line. So I went running out there so I could get him the saw. And I would, anyway, I'll have pictures soon. He's putting me on a front porch to my little shed that I hope will eventually be where I do these recordings at. Although I like doing them in here, what you can't see is what an awful mess my office is. This is the best part of it. And this all needs to be redone. And I need a place to do this while it's getting renovated. So anyway, we're on chapter 3. Well, Liza said somebody's messing with the rumble. I don't know that I know of. No one's messing with it, but shoot, I don't know. How would I know? You're asking the wrong person. Oh, you know what it might be? I was uploading another video, the one that we did with War Hamster last night. So there will be another video on my page later on today. So let me clarify this real quick. Yesterday, I'm saying, and I forgot all about it today, that I was going to be on 2 shows last night. I ended up being on 0 shows because after noon, like sometime around 3 or 4, we were supposed to record the show for last night on Alpha Warriors at 5 o'clock yesterday. He had a late breaking story with a friend of his that had done a major pedophile bust north of Nashville. So he wanted to jump on that. And I'm like, that's absolutely fine. And so we didn't do the Alpha Warrior one. And then I had said, because initially War Hamster had led me to believe we were doing it live, and that was my mistake. So anyway, we did not do that one live either, so I wasn't on at all. But I did do the recording at 9:30, which about killed me. But anyway, as always, Liza and Bridget's always there with me. So they hung out with me while I was doing the interview and provided me references along the way. So I totally appreciate that. Anyway, we're going to get started. We're on number 3, chapter number 3. Okay. Let me just look through. I did this earlier. This is probably going to be another one that we do in a 2-part series because it's fairly in-depth. The one thing that I like about this guy that did this book, Richard Cottrell, he did not necessarily go by location, but he went by event. So there may be 2 or 3 different chapters on Italy covering different events. And it's kind of interesting because what he does is build out the whole scenario for that event and the players. So obviously, many of these players are talked about repeatedly through this book. So this one, he opens the chapter up with a quote from Colonel Edward Lansdale. Psychological warfare is probably man's oldest weapon, aside from bare hands. In using it in today's dirty, secretive wars, meaning Operation Gladio, or in the future, the important thing to remember is that it is a weapon and that a weapon has its own unique use and its own effect. And very much psychological warfare is a weapon. So this takes place, well, he starts the chapter in 2006 with John Bolton having been a short-lived U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and we all know who he is. He once said, quote, "You must understand that the U.S. never acts except in its own interest," unquote. To Bolton, there was nothing intrinsically intimidating in this remark. He is simply expressing a deeply held opinion that most patriotic Americans believe American exceptionalism. Bolton's reputation as a neocon, however, gives it somewhat of a different meaning. Lord Palmerston's famous dictum that, quote, "nations have no permanent friends or allies, they only have permanent interest," unquote. That's probably more of an accurate statement. The author goes on and calls the U.S. a serial trespasser in her own neighborhood, which is absolutely true. Large chunks of real estate somehow ends up in the possession of the United States. And he goes back to, which we've covered now. And it's funny because I've read all of these books and then go back and read them after I've read like 4 more. Like he goes back to the Hawaiian Kingdom, which we've talked about. And the fact that it was crushed by Spain. And then obviously we basically did the same thing. She lost what remained of her empire, meaning Spain, including the crown Cuba. And Teddy Roosevelt called it the Splendid Little War, delightfully rationalizing the behavior of the U.S. on the world stage in that it was pretending to come to the rescue to free these countries like Hawaii, or, Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, when it not Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, when in fact, and many others. But in fact, what we did in the case with like Cuba, they had already basically been fighting for like 30 years. And Spain was at the point of exhaustion. And so they thought us coming in on their behalf that finally, because we're all about freedom, right? That they were going to get their freedom, except for we made them a colony, basically landed the Marines and stayed there for a while. And it was even worse in the Philippines. The Spanish-American War was certainly splendid enough to vault the triumphant Roosevelt to the White House once a vacancy was declared following McKinley's convenient assassination in 1901. In 1904, the unfinished work of the Panama Canal was taken over and fenced off with a client safety strip, the Canal Zone. In 1915, and that's after we basically stole Panama from Colombia. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson, the great peacemaker, quote unquote, exploited riots, instability as an excuse to send Marines ashore in Haiti. They stayed there for the next 20 years until Haiti's debt to American banks were paid off. Canada, and they did that by taking over the harbor like they did in many other places. Canada might have gone the other way, but for the deterrent of ensuing struggle with the British Empire. Cuba was among the most modern engagements along with the Boer War, in which the mass media was shamelessly drafted to the drumbeat of Black propaganda. The charge was led by the Hearst and Pulitzer newspaper chains, who wielded the influence in those days of Rupert Murdoch's Fox News today. Spain was ceaselessly castigated as a bad master and cruel tyrant in her colonies. There was a simmering independence movement forming everywhere, and that formed the pretext to send the battlecruiser USS Maine steaming into the Havana harbor, seemingly to protect American nationals. When the Maine spectacularly blew up with the loss of life of 274 lives, it offered the perfect excuse to provoke a conflict. By the merest coincidence, future President Teddy Roosevelt, de facto First Lord of the U.S. Admiralty, had meticulously planned for such an event down to the last detail. Not like it was premeditated or anything. It was then followed by mass circulation of newspaper stories detailing the Patriot card of how we basically have to go there now and defend our honor. Roosevelt, the last president to worship the great outdoors, besides, he sarcastically says, besides the rancher Bush Jr., led his private troop, the Rough Riders, into the fray. The U.S. immediately became the junior world power. Spain took the full rap for the Maine. The explosion provoked the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine," to hell with Spain. Investigations revealed that 5 tons of powder charges obliterated the forward third of the ship, where most of the crew was resting or sleeping. The following day, Roosevelt made a cryptically understated remark: "We shall never find out definitely the cause of the disaster." Well, how would he know we're never going to find it out unless they're going to hide it? A clutch of official inquiries debated a Spanish mine or spontaneous combustion of the coal bunker. False flag saboteurs was finally squashed. Despite the compromising Roosevelt plan, the political riddle, what Spain might have expected to gain by provoking the U.S., was never answered either. In any event, the important question was always who sank the Maine, not the infinitely lesser one of how it was done. Cuba was destined henceforth to exercise an immense magnetic pull on the American imagination. It was neither an American state nor a colony. And I did want to remember how I tell you they hide really good stuff in footnotes. Listen to this footnote. The eagle-eyed who may happen to catch up with the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid may briefly spot the clarion call, "Remember the Maine," scrolled with lipstick on a bedsheet in the bordello while the pair seek sanctuary after a botched train robbery. They fantasize joining up to fight in Cuba and so escape prison for their crimes. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the Maine. So, the U.S. could reliably manipulate political order in Cuba. Castro succeeded because he won the support of the Cubans angered by the corruption of the ruling regime, which primarily was America. It wasn't even Spain. Our mafia is the one that was down there building casinos and prostituting the young girls. They became a strategic pawn in the great powers game. When the Russians planted rockets in retaliation for the missiles in Turkey, the world came close to nuclear war. The shots that rang out in Dallas one bright November day in 1963 echoed all over Cuba. In 1997, decommissioning of a secret document relating to the JFK assassination revealed the inner court of the American military, the 5 great chiefs who headed the high command coolly hatching a plan to wreak mayhem across America using hired snipers to shoot at citizens walking across the street. They would then pin the blame on saboteurs dressed up like Castro's army. It was the perfect, simple plan. And by that, they're talking about Operation Northwood, which we've talked about repeatedly. It is an axiom of American life that all actions of men and women in military uniform are beyond reproach. Hate the war, love the warrior. Yet here in cold print was a detailed plan for acts of terror to be performed under the American flag on the orders of the highest military commanders in the land. This deadly project, codenamed Northwoods, was dated March 1962, which aimed at garnering international support to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba, fostering the illusion the regime in Havana had actually attacked us. One proposal, blowing up an American vessel in Guantanamo Bay and then blaming it on Cuba, slipped straight from the main playbook. So did the USS Liberty, by the way. While perfectly happy to gun down civilians, the Navy's top brass didn't want blowing up an American ship at sea, as that would entail killing the crew, kind of like they did the Maine. So the fallback plan called for destruction of unmanned ships and staging of simulated funerals. What? Simulated funerals? So wait a minute. We're supposed to believe that the guys who would fake blowing up a ship and fake the deaths of the people wouldn't fake going to the moon? Okay, I'm just going to leave that there. Also, they talked about making copies of Cuban aircraft and flying them, and fabricating a reign of red terror throughout Florida, like we were being attacked by Cuba communists. There was a book called Body of Secrets that talked about the NSA, and James Bamford said a virtual war in which many patriotic Americans and innocent Cubans would have died senseless death, all to satisfy the twisted generals back in Washington, D.C., safe in their taxpayer-financed homes and limousines. Can't disagree with that. One plan offered an eerily familiar premonition and perhaps even some clues concerning the events on 9/11. It called for the hijacking of U.S. passenger jets by soft special forces disguised as Cuban agents. The plane would slip below the radar observation and then be replaced with a pilotless aircraft. Now, keep in mind, this is in the early 60s. This would crash, purportedly killing all of the passengers and crew. The decoy plane would then land safely somewhere in the U.S., leaving the question open as to how all on board could be relied upon to keep silent concerning their adventure. This was not a single item in the Northwood manual that did not amount to a blatant act of treason. The U.S. military establishment dispatched top secret justification for the U.S. intervention in Cuba straight to the desk of McNamara and then on to JFK. And we know that JFK, of course, disapproved it, much to the chagrin of the people in... Sorry about that. He's getting extra feisty today. The logic of Northwood was the strike of Gladio. The general staff inclined towards prefabricated violence because they believed benefits gained by the state counted more than injustice against individuals. The only important criteria was success in reaching whatever objective they set out for. So, and also keep in mind that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during Northwood was Lyman Lemitsker, the four-star general, who, when they were setting up Operation Gladio, was helping with the logistics of it when he was a much more junior ranking person. And I think he was a two-star over in Germany, helping set up the logistical support for Operation Gladio, and then ends up being fired from the Joint Chiefs of Staff because of Northwood and moved to NATO, where he's in charge of all of Operation Gladio as the NATO commander at the same time JFK is murdered by what many people believe were a Gladio unit. So Kennedy observed with considerable reservation what he referred to as the Crown Prince of the Pentagon, General Lyman Lemitsker. And the author goes on and says that the president understood that he was basically concealing what he felt like was an armed, how do I say that? Like he was advocating the flagrant misuse of arms. That's probably the best way to say it. Arthur Schlesinger, who was JFK's intellectual guru, was asked in 1978, I'm going to turn on my light here, if whether the president, JFK, enjoyed a full grasp of everything that was going on in his administration. Schlesinger said, quote, "Well, we certainly weren't in control of the Joint Chiefs," unquote. Kennedy's presidency cut a confusing zigzag between what to do about Cuba, and obviously, he was taking a different approach in Indonesia, which I'm reading a book about that right now, that totally pissed everybody off, especially Europe, because Europe had a deadlock on the mines, and Indonesia had like the largest untapped gold mine in the world. And so if Kennedy had a meeting scheduled in January of the following year to meet with the Indonesian president. And the CIA felt like if they had that meeting, it would ruin their plans, because they were planning on getting rid of that president, and it would give him too much legitimacy for them to turn around and then get rid of him. So they couldn't allow his meeting with Indonesia to go on. And Kennedy had helped with Algeria, which was another thing that totally pissed off the CIA, because they were trying to keep Algeria a colony of France. And neither the French president, Charles de Gaulle, nor Kennedy wanted that to occur. So he thwarted him on that. They did eventually get their freedom. He was going to thwart him on Indonesia. And he was totally against the Lumumba takeout that Eisenhower had authorized like 2 weeks before he left the presidency. So Kennedy was at odds with the CIA on a range of different areas, to include Cuba, not just one or two. And basically, Lemitsker was a buddy of Eisenhower. He actually worked for Eisenhower to set up the logistical network for Operation Gladio. Because keep in mind, Eisenhower was in the European theater while Allen Dulles was setting up Operation Gladio with Reinhard Gehlen. Lemetzger was his like logistics chief, Eisenhower. So they were two peas in a pod. They worked together in North Africa and in Sicily. And Eisenhower's hunch was renewed by an accomplished manner in which Lemetzger deployed carefully nuanced diplomacy and his understanding of German ways in a top secret mission, which Eisenhower believed vital to the outcome of the war that was in Africa. He provoked, let's see, there was an issue with Churchill and his pet general, which was Bernard Montgomery, and it had far-reaching consequences after the war. So there was this myth of a fortress that the Soviet hoax designed to allow Stalin an unchallenged lunge at Berlin. It succeeded brilliantly, thanks largely to Hitler's audacity and the shock that he administered to the Allies with the famous boomerang known as the Battle of the Bulge. German tanks suddenly burst out of the Belgian forest and gave the advancing Allies a black eye. Eisenhower, the rarest of supreme commanders, one who never in his entire career saw men die in action at the front line, took this as a clear warning that the Germans were far from exhausted or defeated. In the background, time flailed the generals for twiddling their thumbs. Lemetzger played a neat hand. He was up with the masters of the universe alongside Allen Dulles, looking across the table at enemy negotiators, at whose side he might have found himself only marginally adjusted historically for circumstances. The Germans bought the counterfeit line that standing down would amount to a pause until the war resumed, this time against the Soviets. Lemetzger thus demonstrated he was already a magician at the art of deception. The Lutheranism that Lemetzger imbibed as a child made him an excellent fit with the embitteredly anti-communist Prussian mindset, which overtook American military leadership after World War II. Many in the U.S. officers' corps scarcely bothered to conceal their admiration for Hitler and his punishment of what they referred to as the godless Russia, which of course was not Russia, it was the Soviet Union. So, during that time, you also had to keep in mind that there was lots of information about the scientific achievements of what Germany was doing in rocket technology and stuff like that, which dazzled the Americans. So Lemetzger viewed that as a prize if they could get that away from both the Soviets and the Nazis. Lemetzger interpreted the Clash of Titans as an ongoing struggle between light and darkness, God's own elect, the chosen people, us, pitched against the evil Soviet Empire. Hardly by coincidence, this was exactly the driving force the fascist terrorist with strong ties to the Catholic Church volunteered for Gladio armed struggle. That was basically the same catch, because they had set up the Vatican Bank to be the money launderers, and how they funded the whole Operation Gladio using that same kind of message. Once Eisenhower arrived in the White House, Lemetzger's prospects was like a vertical takeoff. First, commander of U.S. forces in the Far East, then Army Chief of Staff, and finally the chairman, all in the space of 5 years, which is, I mean, you normally spend 2 years in each of those jobs, so that's not like meteor, but It is pretty quick. So when he joined the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had been in charge of the UN troops in Korea, which of course is where we went after World War II into the Korean War. Leminsker took care to associate himself with all of the most hawkish schemes. Eisenhower, with his own family roots in Germany's Rhineland, and less than fully paid up Prussian, presided over what was in effect a military government, spending more time with his chiefs of staff, meaning the military, and playing war games than he did dealing with any civil issue at all. The Pentagon was always his real command bunker. And he basically had set up like a round-the-clock War Department. And it happened because Eisenhower's national security policy, the New Look is what it was called, replaced and the discarded strategy of limited war, and was based on the unstoppable nuclear strike capability and the reorganization of the Strategic Air Command, which kind of is very interesting with him making that shift, because what happens as a result of that is almost in every instant after that, the Joint Chiefs of Staff considered a nuclear strike, especially tactical nuclear strikes like the smaller nukes, part of a normal going to war. It's almost as if that's the reason why they dropped the nuclear weapons in Japan, is so that they could then make the argument that it could be used much more often on a smaller scale. The Supreme Allied commander in Europe, so he eventually, like I was telling you, when he got fired, he ends up going over to Europe. And let's see. Also, this author talks about how Eisenhower was basically a Jehovah's Witness for the most part. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, he says, is rabid anti-communist, which is kind of weird because that's kind of what Liza and Bridget and I have been uncovering, is the close association with religions like the Moonies and the Unification Church and the Davidians, all of these guys being used almost as part of this apparatus. And the Catholic Church was certainly used after World War II, and they were used in Vietnam to move 1 million people down in the South so then they could kill them all. So it's just kind of weird, the intermixing in a way that I had never realized before. Leminsker deduced Americans were indeed living through dangerous times and that the enemy was both inside and outside of the gates. He saw an enemy around every corner. The constitutional order in Leminsker's eyes was subordinate at all times to national security, which it's exactly the opposite. But, you know, hey. Eisenhower had basically put a lot of confidence in Leminsker. And his chief campaign promise had been to do something about the Korean mess that had been set up over there after the war. And which is kind of interesting that, you know, he would have, Leminsker supposedly was over there to fix that. The Army and Air Force plunged into a turf war over control of the nuclear strike capability. Uh, that's actually happened more than once as far as different weapon systems in that, like the space. The Army, kind of weird that they had a space command. My old boss, when I was deployed, the Army two-star, General Jay Garner, ends up being the Army Space Command commander. And I was like, what? What are y'all doing with um, a space command? Isn't that kind of weird that the Army would have a space command um, since it's kind of in the air? I don't know. It seems like it ought to be an Air Force mission, but what do I know? Um, but it's funny because there are a lot of inefficiencies in the military because of those turf wars. And you kind of understand, although it's not a good thing, that you have these general officers that grow up within a service, and the Navy and the Army, because they're so much older and there's so much more doctrinal entrenched thought there, that the Air Force, as the Johnny come lately and always have been high tech, they're not wedded to any doctrinal anchors. That's not true in the Army and the Navy primarily. And the Navy, of course, goes back forever. And it was the only way you got around for a very long time. And so they are very entrenched in doctrinal thought processes and the way you're supposed to do things. The same is true with the Army. And I can say that because I had several joint assignments and worked with all of them. Probably the only one that thinks similarly to the Air Force is the Marines. And that's because really the Marines are everybody. They have their own ships, they have their own airplanes, and they have their own foot soldiers. So they're literally a mini everything capability. And because they float around on ships, they are like and this is no kidding, this is the doctrinal use of the Marines. They're the first 72 hours. So between the ships, weaponry, and the aircraft that the Marines and the Navy has, they have any mission that pops off anywhere in the world, they have the first 72 hours. That's what it takes for the Air Force to take their fighter packages, their air packages, and move forward. So the Air Force gets the notice, the flag goes down, they have 72 hours to get out the door and be someplace. And those 72 hours are covered by the Expeditionary Marines. They call them MUs, Marine Expeditionary Units. And that's what they do. They have MAGTFs. They have all kinds of sizes, but it's basically just an expeditionary unit. And there's a lot of dogma that goes with the funding and who's going to have what missions. But the Army always thinks they've got to be in charge of everything. And there's a lot more of them, quite frankly. When you go to a joint assignment, like I was at CENTCOM for 3 years, for every other 3 services, the Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force. So for those 3 people, there's like 3 Army. So they are on staff on like a 3-to-1 ratio. And it matters because when joint commands, they write war documents that tells you what capability they need to do like a major and a minor engagement. They're writing the documents that determine the manpower and the mission areas for how the service, the Air Force, is going to look. Because if this combatant commander says, here's my big event and here's my smaller event, and these 2 can happen at the same time, which is based on presidential directives or guidance. And they say, in order to do this major thing, I need 5 air wings. And 2 of those air wings can be Navy and Marines. And then 3 of them can be Air Force. They don't necessarily say which service, but they do talk about capability, and you write capability in to this. So that's very interesting. And there are some capabilities that only the Air Force has, like A-10s. So if they say they want close air support and it's going to do X, Y, and Z, and that A-10 is the only package that can do that, then they're specifically asking for Air Force requirements. And so that kind of stuff matters. That doctrinal dogma stuff matters. And if there's a new weapon system that comes along, like tactical nuclear weapons, they want control of that, because that means they get more manpower, they get more money, and the more money and manpower they get, the more general officer billets they get. And that's literally the way they think. So I didn't want to just brush over that. I wanted y'all to understand how important that is. So supposedly they had a big deal over what they referred to in 1956 as the revolt of the colonels between the Army and the Air Force on who was going to get the nuclear strike mission. And eventually the Air Force got that. So also you had the Navy Chief Representative, let's see, a guy that by the name of Steamboat Willie was accused, smart and ruthless Air Force leaders, of using techniques borrowed from Leninist textbooks to subvert authority from within. In fact, it was Leminsker who incited the rocket wars with the Air Force. As World War II closed, he toured the defeated Reich, shopping for promising ex-Nazis who helped Hitler's secret weapons programs. Some of them candidates for a one-way excursion to the Nuremberg trials. Leminsker foresaw with considerable insight the silo of the future, Hitler's rocket ranges reinvented to catapult American missiles with nuclear warheads, vast differences. Leminsker's prize catch was Werner von Braun, the Führer's rocket man and designer of the first projectile to achieve suborbital flight. He got spirited to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and there was equipped with basically everything that he could imagine in order to create the weapons of mass destruction. But to Leminsker's huge chagrin, rocket science left successive U.S. governments stone cold until they woke up one October morning in 1957 with Russia's unexpected full pull from space. According to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, scrambling together a hasty excuse to cover its embarrassment for being exposed, the Soviet Union had been drained of strategic resources to boot this insulting tin football upstairs. The U.S. intelligence was once again exposed and was basically no match for the Russians. We were no match for the Russians. So Sputnik rose to the heavens atop a prototype Soviet missile with intercontinental range. And again, I make sure that I tell everybody that there was a lot of technology left in the Soviet Union because the Nazis had used the Soviet Union as a place to build weaponry of all kinds in the World War One to two, in order to basically they didn't do it to give them the technology, but they gave them the technology because it was Soviet workers that were working in many of those plants. So, he went on to say that the war was pointless unless waged with total ruthlessness. The race was intended to survive and dominate, and you should never flinch from a final solution. And When he was approached with the thought of exterminating entire civilizations like a deranged eugenics project, um, he didn't really seem to mind that. As a matter of fact, many people that had listened to him said he enthusiastically endorsed it. So there was a atomic zealot, Herman Kahn, Kahn, who um, was the inspiration for Dr. Strangelove. Kahn argued the US would always need the capability to destroy opponents with a preemptive strike. Kahn also said he regarded nuclear war as an ultimate expression of freedom. As director of the RAND Corporation, CIA front company people, Kahn lowered the pole of nuclear war probably irreversibly. He discarded the moral dimension as irrelevant to the debate. He also marked a watershed in which policy wonks like him encouraged the military leadership to view with contempt the elected political class as lacking the courage to push the button out of fear that the planet would vanish in a puff of smoke. The owlish Khan did not intend himself to be found in the apocalypse, but he didn't mind that other people were going to have to die because he was going to be in a bunker. Khan and his friends argued about if there was such a doomsday, life would go on, much like the Black Death of the 14th century. In the White House, under Leminster's influence, Eisenhower too surrendered to the braying of the nuclear hawks. Khan been dead for 25 years, but his rantings cling to the collective consciousness of the people that were in charge. So, I'm just reading down through here to get here is a quote from an author. Concern had grown that a belligerent and free-willing military could conceivably become as dangerous to the stability of the United States as the mixture of rebelliousness and politics had in nations forced to succumb to fascism. And that's exactly what they were looking for. That was the whole plan. Okay. So they were basically there was a one-sided presentation about advocating danger to our security. This would basically be under the creed of Gladio, and Fort Bragg units were already hard at work in Sardinia, steeping the European secret soldiers in the mythical lore of psychological warfare. They had, and so basically he's talking about, and we discovered early on in our research that Sardinia was a training site for the Gladio units used throughout Europe, specifically after World War II for the training that Scorzeni arranged. So then he makes note of the fact that Korea was a messy kind of draw line, and Vietnam had gotten off to a really crazy start and then sunk into a quagmire. And you had Castro, which basically was an embarrassment. And yet you still had these general officers walking around preening and cooing about how great they were. And Lemetzger steadfastly refused to recognize Kennedy as the legal commander of the military. In talks recorded for Pentagon archives in 1972, he consistently said General rather than President Eisenhower, even referring to Eisenhower during the time that he was um, president. He didn't even call him a president. It was like he was supposed to be um, just another echelon of command and not an actual president. The open defiance of the big rule book called the Constitution, which subordinates the military to the strict supervision of a civilian hierarchy, Lemetzger waived his alternative that the political caste crippled by inexperience in military affairs should leave the important decisions up to the generals. There's some that still think that today. Another author wrote, quote, in Lemetzger's view, the country would be far better off if the generals could take over, unquote. And I'm not unsure that that's not what Gladio actually did, is allowed the generals through the paramilitary to basically take over. And in many cases, especially with JFK, it didn't matter who was in charge. They did whatever they wanted. This same author believed that cooking up the Northwood scheme demonstrated that the top brass had quietly slipped over the edge. I have to agree. Lemetzger viewed every act of the administration as a shackling of the military, talking about JFK. He didn't want JFK talking to the Soviet Union. He didn't want JFK talking to Cuba. And I don't know whether y'all know or not, but he at Cuba, JFK was actually negotiating with Cuba through a third party right up until it had just started a few months before, where they were actually going to make an announcement that basically said they were going to stop the embargo and stuff like that and get back on a much better, stronger footing with each other. I can't imagine how that would have ended up. It would have obviously pissed off. And see, that's what I really think is behind comments like what Felix Rodriguez was sharing with Tucker and their absolute hatred for JFK. And I mean, he's been dead since the 1960s. So it's kind of weird. And you really have to understand that the thought that Kennedy would be talking and that peace would be better than stabbing someone in the back is what haunts those people and what generates that absolute hatred of JFK from these people. Lemetzger, let's see. JFK tried to basically isolate Lemetzger from seizing control of any of the initiatives and to basically kind of box him out of any of the decisions made about Cuba. And the author says, in truth, it was the Biscayne Boulevard boys in Miami who backed a coup by their puppet stooge, Batista. When it became clear he was facing a rout in the upcoming general election, it took Castro another 7 years to wear down the Florida mafia and their CIA backers. When he finally came to power in 1959, there was an instant coalition of the losers. The drug trade ground to a halt. The boards went up on the casinos. Foreign corporations were unceremoniously booted out. The military stopped buying American weapons, and thousands of Vatican priests were hustled off the island. And so let's go over each one of these because every one of these is so important. So the first thing he did was kick out the drug traffickers. Now, keep in mind, this is how NATO was paying for Operation Gladio, was the drugs that they're moving from the Vietnam Golden Triangle area through Sicily, or in that case, mostly at the time through the Corsican Mafia into Cuba, and then up the coast to New York and into Canada. Okay, so Cuba is huge as far as the drug trade goes at this time. So Castro shut down their money-making opportunity there. He pissed off the military-industrial complex because he's not going to buy any more weapons. And they were using Cuba to run guns. It was a huge operation. Then he shut down the mafia's casinos. Okay, so that was crazy. Somebody's celebrating the fact that the casinos were shut down. And the Vatican Church is how they were. So a lot of these Cuban exiles, that they call them, was going into the churches and claiming sanctuaries and using them to hide out to attack Castro. So immediately when Castro came to power, they had to go. So he had their number, in other words. He knew exactly what they were going to do. A lot of the Italian mafia used the Vatican for money laundering and other nefarious things. And this was at the same time in the aftermath of World War II, when they had set up the new P2 Masonic Lodge that was running this whole operation as well. So Castro just fortuitously kicked them all out. So he picked all of the worst enemies he could have and still survived. Okay, so CIA's Bay of Pigs misadventure in April 1961 was the perfect catastrophe from start to finish. And here's a funny thing. Operation Zapata. This was the first book that I had read that talked about Operation Zapata. You have to understand that Zapata is the name of Bush Sr.'s oil company that he set up in Texas. Isn't that crazy? And Zapata actually was an oil field that they found off the coast of Cuba too, because Zapata is a location inside of Cuba. So that was where they were going to basically be doing the landing. So the author does note that Zapata Oil Company was founded in 1953, which would have been right around the time Bush was known to be in the CIA as an actual agent. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Operation Zapata got its name, and it was named the operation, because keep in mind, you can name the operation anything, right? So that's just crazy. Unoriginal Nazis. Liza, I love you. So crazy. So it was a precursor to the Halliburton type of petro industry operation. Zapata entertained hopes of breaking up the global extraction cartel exerted by the Seven Sisters by pushing into exploration and production in America's near abroad waters in its own right. The company found itself cheated of potentially ripe drilling prospects, particularly in the region of Zapata Peninsula, when Castro took over. So keep in mind that you have this ongoing massive, do the balloons. I don't know how to do it. It just happens. It's something with my hand. I know if you do that in front of the camera, it does, but see, then sometimes it doesn't. I don't know. Um, yeah, so it's totally weird that the whole Zapata thing and the hard on about Castro. There's nothing about Cuba that warrants the effort that was ongoing for decades. There's something more about that, either that hard set grudge like of uh, George H.W. Bush that just perpetuates. You know what I'm saying? There's just something about it that's way outside of proportion to what actually happened. Um, so, anyway, they clearly hope to regain them in the wake of a successful invasion, meaning the oil fields. There is quite strong hint at private enterprise funding of the expedition, at least in some parts, given the company's interest political connections. In passing, it would be noted that Cuba remains an attractive proposition for prospering unexplored reserves just 70 miles off the coast of Florida and the present offshore economic development zone that is contain at least 20 billion barrels of reserve. That rises the expectations of some of the new Libyan style discoveries. So, I mean, obviously they were after the oil. And as one of the other authors said, Leminsker had more than a shrewd idea. Zapata was doomed, the actual operation, but did nothing to halt it, even though he had strong opportunities to interject a military opinion of the fact that it was going to fail. Leminsker's priceless experience gained in the Allied invasions in North Africa and South Europe expertly placed him in place to judge just how effective the CIA plans were. Years later, Leminsker handwrote a detailed 52-page appraisal of the entire affair called the Cuban debacle, which he kept locked away at home. This secret confession described the opinion of the Joint Chiefs that the CIA, force-fed with worthless intelligence peddled by a Florida mob hankering after their bordellos that they had gotten kicked out of in Cuba, had no sensible grasp on the risk involved in putting ashore an inexperienced bunch of mercenaries against a trained army. In view of the rapid buildup of the Castro government's military and militia capability and the lack of predictable future mass discontent, the possible success of a paramilitary plan appears very doubtful. Since that was the kernel of the plan, it was obviously doomed. How then to explain the cheerful opinion that Leminsker delivered to Robert McNamara, declaring that the Joint Chiefs reached a favorable assessment of the likelihood of achieving military success? Leminsker's motives were political and cunning at the same time. He was determined to prevent the upstart CIA getting above themselves and doing the Pentagon's work of running successful invasions. And he confidently anticipated the Kennedy government dissolving as the direct consequences of the disaster. So basically, he was hoping for a soft coup. Leminsker's silence was a psychological act of deception in which he rebelled. The purpose was to butterfly the president's wings to a disaster, damned if the invasion collapsed through faulty conception, and equally damned if the ground forces were denied crucial air support. So you have the Joint Chiefs of Staff setting up the president. After years under tight wrap, an even half-witted claims from the Pentagon spokesperson that the junior filing clerk somehow mislaid it. Doctored extractions of the Commission of Inquiry ordered by JFK in the wake of the debacle finally surfaced in 1998. That's some shitty filing. The inquest was chaired by General Maxwell Taylor, a hugely provocative provocation, a huge provocation to push under Limetker's nose. Taylor was himself a former Army Chief of Staff and thus member of the Pentagon War Court. There he made himself an avowed enemy of almost everything Limetker stood for, because Kennedy actually had Taylor over on his staff as a personal advisor, and that pissed Limetker off too, because he felt like he was being usurped. So all of that would have been quite sufficient to earn a threatening glower from Limetker, but JFK rubbed salt in the wound. He hired Taylor as his personal military rep. And Taylor frequently insinuated himself into gatherings of the Pentagon Magic Circle. Limetker would signal his fury in the presence of Taylor by pointedly absenting himself from the room. One should never underestimate the potential of this embarrassing rebuke to Limetker's exalted status in cultivating future mischief, which I'm clearly saying that Limetker was responsible as NATO's commander during the time that JFK was murdered. Limetker found himself hauled as a star witness to a kangaroo court rigged as he saw it to protect Kennedy and the jelly-kneed, soft-shoed intellectuals around him. Still, the record reveals Limetker weaseling miserably, claiming he had only seen the Zapata blueprints for evaluation and never formally approved them, which was absolutely untrue. As the story dribbled out under withering questioning from the chief prosecutor, none other than Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Zapata was exposed as littered with false flag scams the CIA was addicted to. To make the escapade look like an all-immigrant show, a few antique B-62s repainted in Cuban colors were flown from Nicaragua to Castro's airfields, giving away his intimacy with every nut and bolt of the disastrous project. Limetker admitted they were never intended to accomplish the destruction of the Castro's Air Force. They were to lend plausibility to the story that the D-Day landing strikes had been launched from within Cuba. So brilliantly successful was this ruse that the Russian ambassador denounced it the very same day at the UN headquarters in New York as a dastardly act by Americans. Most of the planes landed in Miami without firing their guns, although they did manage to drop some bombs. Now, most of you may not understand the significance of what I just said. It has always been folklore forever that Kennedy is the one that screwed up the air support and like canceled it, called it off, proved it at the last minute. I've heard it said like 50 different ways. What you are reading is an entirely different story that is in congressional testimony, that they purposely used particular aircraft to basically, because their story after the fact was going to be, it was Cubans' own citizens, current citizens, not the idiots living in Miami, that took off and was bombing their own country, not the CIA, not DC, not the military. And they didn't supposedly launch from Guatemala either, which they did. So the entire air campaign garbage that we've been fed for decades is a lie. It's all a lie. JFK didn't screw any of that up. He took the blame for it because it happened on his watch, but he didn't screw anything up. And people, again, I keep picking on him, but this Felix Rodriguez, who got on Tucker and basically claimed that it was JFK's fault that their stupid ass landing, which Leminsker is even saying was doomed to fail because they're stupid. And we're sending a bunch of rookie civilians, although they may be assassins, they were not trained in how to defeat somebody like Castro, who had been fighting for like a decade, all trained by the US military. Hello? It's just dumb. The whole thing was dumb. So, anyway, I wanted to make sure that we got that part in here so that everybody understood there's a completely different story. And if you want to go back, it would behoove you to go read the testimony of the actual investigation that was done into that. Kennedy's people quickly discovered Eisenhower had lost control of operations in the Indochina arena, meaning Vietnam, while the civil war between the CIA and the Pentagon had broke out anew even there. And again, not understanding, we were never in Vietnam to win. We were in Vietnam because we were running drugs. The war was a sidekick. All of the dead bodies, they don't give a shit. You could mount up 1 million dead bodies, and as long as they can run their drugs and make their money, they don't care. That's the reality of these people. And then the author talks about, there also is a note here, Brigadier General David Gray, which was chief aide responsible for Cuba, to destroy all of his personal diaries recording the Joint Chiefs of Staff actions and discussions during the lead up to the landings. Gray's meticulous notes formed the only detailed official records. Destruction of those papers was a felony, and they did it anyway. Because I mean, this guy is a brigadier general aide to like one of the 4 stars or whatever, because that's kind of the way they do that. My job as an exec to a 1-star general, that was your job, was to sit in there and take notes. And those notes are filed electronically, and they're covered by the Records Act. It is against the law. You'll go to jail for not handling those. You're going to get court-martialed if you did it maliciously. But these people never are held accountable for that. I'm going to stop right there. Let's see what time it is. Yeah, I'm going to stop right there because they transitioned from Cuba into Vietnam, and some of the shenanigans that were pulled there during this time. And that's a good transition for us. Let me find my bookmarker to start there on Sunday night. So I know Liza's been entertaining you guys with her Bitch and Brian comment. Khashoggi was running weapons through Cuba with Skorzeny. That is true. Colonel, you made the peace sign with your hands and that sparks the balloon. Is that what does it? Let's try it. All right. I don't see any balloons. Maybe you got to do it up high. I don't know. Let's see. Watching Trump's rally. Yeah, no, I completely understand. I understand this is probably going to be a catch up and watch on another day. I just wanted to actually get it done so that it's out there for you guys to have. Also, when we get off of this, there will be another video, if you haven't watched it already, on War Hamster's channel, of War Hamster, me, and the ghost of Base Patrick Henry discussing Turkey and the Congo. And there's a lot of historical information, but what's going on today information as well. So I highly encourage you, if you want to be the know-it-all around the water cooler tomorrow, to take a look at that video. It's very interesting. Two very, very smart guys. Let's see. Jester of Knights. Trudeau is a J, by the way. JS. A lot of people look at like young Fidel. Yeah. Killer show with War Hamster. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing the shows with those guys. Very interesting. Jack Ruby in charge of Miami casinos and Cuba. He did have, he had a lot to do with that. I go back, let's see. Castro bad is Trotskyite propaganda. That ran for 50 years. I agree with you. I'm not saying I'm a big Castro fan, but I'm also saying that everything that we were told about him has been a lie. Bitchy Brian. The citizens of all the islands down there knew the alternative. You're the bomb from Towner. Well, thank you, Texas Armadillo. I appreciate that. Any idea what roles Armenia plays today? Other than being the victim? Armenia, they're like, at least they got a country. In many ways, they're like the Kurds. They get beat up on from all sides. We've not looked into and done a full-blown research project in Armenia. We will get there. But just from the history I know from having been on active duty and in that area on deployments, it's like it's literally the Cinderella. I mean, it's the shitty, they get all the shit. I can tell you that. They got beat up on forever by Turkey. They get beat up on by Azerbaijan. And there just seems to be like nothing they can do to win. So anyway, thank you guys for sticking it out with me. I appreciate it. And I will see you guys back here on Sunday night. Hopefully I'll be able to talk with you guys tomorrow at noon on our ongoing spaces. But anyway, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule and being here with us.